You know, I've always been supportive of the Freedom Church of the Poor and his mission, and I think is a very important concept, Freedom Church of the Poor, and what that means, especially in our society at this particular period in its history. Um, King, uh, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, raised this whole concept of the Freedom Church of the Poor, and he raised it uh, uh, in relationship to the need to get the poor, which is at the very bottom of society, to get them to take action together, get them to take action together so that they can become a new and unsettling force. That if they can take action together, they can move the entire nation. And there's a lot to say about when the bottom moves, everything moves. Uh, that in the struggle against American slavery, it was the slaves and poor whites in that period that moved. If they didn't move, there was no way that slavery would have moved. The role of the poor whites and poor blacks in the Union Army, and the role of poor whites in the South that disaffected from the Confederate Army and fought against the slave owners of American society that controlled the entire society. That slaveocracy, that slave power would have never moved if the bottom didn't move. And of the bottom, it's always been the youth that have been the first to awaken, that they have been the most open to new ideas and solution to problems that they're facing. And I think this is very important, this history, especially given the fact that today that history has burdened us with the fact that the poor and dispossessed, which is growing in the richest country in the world, is the most disunited, the most disorganized, the most racially segregated, the most disenfranchised, the most imprisoned. That's who's in the prison, poor folks in our society. And their disunity has been a way in which the whole of society has been kept under control. And this built on history of ruling classes and of the wealthy and how they have been the 1% that controlled the 99% throughout history, all the way back to the Roman Empire, days of the Bible, that you had this 1% that was able to control the poor and dispossessed, the exploited, the slaves, by keeping them at each other's throats, keeping them disunited. The youth over here, the elders over here, the blacks over here, the whites over there, you name it, language differences, whatever they could use to emphasize the differences in a way that allowed them to divide and conquer. That's the sacred doctrine of control. And so this problem that we've inherited from world history and from our country's history of the bottom being disunited and needing to take action together in order to move the society is something that keeps coming back to me when I think about the Freedom Church of the Poor. And I think we're in a period of growing poverty in the midst of plenty, in a society that has a productive capacity where no one has to go without. That God has created a world and a productivity and a capacity to produce everything that every man, woman, and child need in this society. And yet, that is not the case. That we have a society of inequality where a few is controlling everything and have all the wealth, while more and more of us are suffering. So this concept of Freedom Church of the Poor raises some very basic question about our society and the class realities of society. And certainly the youth, historically, in every progressive movement or any movement of society forward, it was the youth that played a very important and leading role in the changes in society and challenging the status quo throughout the situation. And I think one of the things that has facilitated this inequality and the control by a tiny few people who was able to obtain and concentrate wealth unto themselves has been to keep the poor, but particularly the youth poor, ignorant of their history, ignorant of the possibilities, ignorant of the situation of what they're facing and the class realities of our country. Uh, and I think Freedom Church is a concept that put forth a theology that counters that whole notion and gets to the truth of our society and the injustice of our society. When you have poverty in the midst of plenty, you have abandonment in the midst of abundance. This is something that has to be challenged by the Freedom Church of the Poor and by the theology of Christ. Christ himself was poor. Christ himself was homeless. Christ himself, organized in the bottom of the Roman society in Nazareth, in the ghetto of the society among the poor, because of the role of the poor in changing society. In that stage, the building of the Christian movement against the existing structures of the Roman society. And Jesus Christ became such a threat that they had to execute him through the use of the Roman cross. And the Roman cross, historically, all the way back to Spartacus, was used to take revolutionaries who were threatening the relationships of society and subjected them to crucifixion. Some 5,000 to 6,000 slaves during a revolt, slave revolt led by Spartacus, was executed by the Roman cross. Christ was executed by the Roman cross. Why? Because he was just helping the poor? No, because he was building a movement to revolutionize the values, to change the values, to threaten the values that upheld a unequal society at that time. And I think there's a lot about that history that we have to understand. And again, the way that they've been able to control this, particularly the youth, is to separate the youth from that history. So I want to say that first of all, and really help people to reflect on the problems that we're dealing with today. And the problems are connected with the growth of poverty, and yet the most impoverished are the most disunited, the most disorganized section of the population. And that enables those who benefit from the status quo to maintain the status quo of injustice, of exploitation. Now, my name is Willie Baptist, like a Baptist church, and I tend to want to preach. And I was given just a few minutes to say a few words. So I'm going to try to just keep to that agenda for the rest of my statement. But I want to just say a little bit more about myself. I've been poor all my life. I lived on the streets of Philadelphia, homeless. And I went through a whole process of development where major events shape who I am. And I think if you want to know who I am, you need to know about these events. And the role of the youth in these events was prominent. I was 17-year-old when, in 1965, some 60,000 to 100,000 folks in impoverished community of Watts, California, which was one of the poorest, if not the poorest neighborhood in the entire state of California, erupted in violent protests and militant protests against the inhumane conditions that they lived under. The youth during that period in all the ghettos was having to suffer from upwards of 50 to 60% unemployment at that time. And they were at the forefront of the protests and the eruption that took place in that period. I was 17 years old. I got involved with that, and I seen things turn upside down out there. I seen amen sisters, conducting traffic, battling the police, trying to save kids from being beaten by the police during the midst of that uprising. Uh, and in that period of uprising, inaugurated a whole period of uprising throughout the so-called black ghettos throughout the country, Detroit, Newark. There was this mass awakening and protest against the inhumane conditions that the black masses was suffering from. And that also sparked other movements of the poor in other communities and their activities during that period of the late 60s. And the youth was at the forefront of those struggles. And it was their ignorance that limited their ability to transform those movements into a transforming motion and changing this country. And so they were beaten back by the National Guard, beaten back by the police, beaten back by all the forces of power at that stage. But the impression that it left on me was the role of the youth, the role of the poor, the role of the dispossessed, and how those two things have to be understood and brought to the forefront if we're going to actually move society. We can be angry all we want and be upset all we want and complain all we want. But unless we do, as King pointed out, get the poor to take action together, develop the Freedom Church of the Poor, we're not going to move. You're not going to be able to move and change society for the better from the top down. History says no. You're not going to be able to change it from the middle up. History says no. And history is the experience of millions of people. History says that if it's going to change, it's got to change from the bottom. And that's what King was alluding to in the last years of his life. And at this moment, I'm just recalling the influence that Marion Wright Edelman had on me, the founder of the Children's Defense Fund. Two things. She played a very important role in the igniting of the Poor People's Campaign. Her and Senator Kennedy brought the whole idea to the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, and from there he took it on and proceeded to try to get the poor to take action together. I think that's what got him killed, because he was attempting to move the bottom. But Marion Wright Edelman was one among the few leaders who raised that issue. And I think that's a very important issue, and it's a very relevant issue today, because at the base of all our problems, the problems of the youth, the problems of education, the problems of war and peace, the problems of health care, all these problems are rooted in the position of the poor. And if you can move the poor, you can move those issues. And this is what King, in the last year of his life, was committed to, was the movement of the poor. And his concept of Freedom Church was connected to the poor in the moving of the bottom, the least of these, realizing that we're in an economy, in a system where the least of these is becoming all of us, all of these. And if you can move the least of these, you can move them. But moving them requires this recognition of the role of the youth. I don't think I've been involved with organizing in poor, impoverished community among the homeless for 60 years this year. I don't think I would have made the kind of commitment I made if I wasn't open as a youth, 17 years old, to get involved. And a lot of youth today, around a lot of the questions that are being put before us, are being radicalized, like I was radicalized. I thought, before the uprisings, that my problem was only my problem. But when you see tanks coming down your community, and you see caravans of sheriffs and police with their shotgun out coming through your community, that awaken you to the fact that the problem is not just your problem. It's a social problem, and a social problem has to be resolved by a social movement. And again, you've got to have a movement, a social movement today that is based in the movement of the poor, and the unity and organization of the poor, a Freedom Church of the Poor. And the youth has to be at the forefront of that process. It's no accident that King himself, when he got involved, was, he's 26 years old. A lot of the youth, you look at the key leaders that have participated in social movements and world history, not only history of this country. They've been young, they've been youth. And we got to get to the youth. We got to get to the children. The other thing about Marion Wright Edelman, when she started the Children's Defense Fund, at that time, we were in our organizing of the Homeless Union and organizing of the poor. We had to deal with young families, with kids, and what are we going to do with the children? And we referenced the Bible and Jesus's attitude toward the children, and I think that is another aspect of the youth that we have to take into account. And so, in our organizing, we took up the slogan that the children are not in the way; they are the way. And people know that what Jesus had to say about the people having to come to heaven as a child. These are deeply deep values that we have to embrace if we're going to build a kind of movement that's going to change the situation that we face today. And so I think I'll stop there. As you can see, I can sit here and talk all day long, but I want to wish everybody well in the Freedom Church. I'm very supportive. I'm trying to, with the work that we're doing now, to reignite the homeless union. We're going to hold out Freedom Church and that whole concept very high, and just get these these young leaders that we have met to really deeply understand what we mean when we say Freedom Church of the Poor.